What drives a woman who spent years healing children to become their destroyer, when the very hands that wiped tears become instruments of suffocation? On Christmas Eve 1847, in the candle-lit nursery of Willowbrook Plantation, Mercy killed 3 innocent children while they slept, smothering the master's offspring with the same gentle care she once used to rock them to sleep. But Mercy wasn't born a killer. She was made one, forged in the fires of unspeakable loss and a betrayal so profound it shattered her soul beyond repair. This is the story of how love became vengeance, how a healer became a murderer, and how one woman's fury changed Virginia forever. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Now let's begin. The screaming started at dawn, but the children had been dead for hours. Margaret Whitmore's shrieks echoed through the halls of Willowbrook Plantation as she discovered her 3 babies cold and still in their beds, their faces peaceful as angels, their small bodies already stiff with death. But there was no peace for Mercy that morning. She knelt in the corner of the nursery, hands clasped in prayer, tears streaming down her weathered face as the chaos erupted around her. The constable would arrive within hours. The questions would come. The rope was already being prepared, but Mercy felt nothing except the hollow ache where her heart used to be. She had loved those children once. Little Thomas, 8 years old with his father's stubborn chin and his mother's gentle eyes. Sweet Caroline, barely 6, who still sucked her thumb and called Mercy Mama when her real mother wasn't listening. And baby James, just 2 years old, who had learned to walk by clutching Mercy's skirts and following her everywhere like a shadow. For 8 years, she had been their nurse, their protector, their second mother. She had kissed their scraped knees, sung them to sleep, held them through nightmares. And last night she had pressed pillows over their faces until they stopped breathing. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same hands that had delivered over 40 babies in the county, that had saved countless children from fever and sickness, had snuffed out 3 young lives in the space of an hour. But those deaths weren't the beginning of her story. They were the end of it. The real story had started 8 years earlier, when she was still called Rebecca, when she still believed that love could cross the color line, when she thought her own children were safe in their beds. Margaret Whitmore burst through the nursery door, her nightgown trailing behind her, her face already swollen with tears. She fell to her knees beside Thomas's bed, gathering his lifeless body in her arms, shaking him as if she could wake him from this eternal sleep. "My babies," she sobbed, "my precious babies. What happened? What happened to them?" But even as she asked, her eyes found Mercy in the corner, and something cold and terrible passed between them. A recognition, a knowing. Margaret had always been clever, perhaps too clever for her own good. "You," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above her grief. "You did this. You killed my children." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Mercy didn't deny it. She couldn't. The truth was written in her silence, in the way she held herself perfectly still, in the resignation that had settled over her like a burial shroud. She had spent the last 8 years serving this family, loving their children more than her own life, and now she had destroyed everything she had once protected. The constable arrived as the sun reached its peak, his boots heavy on the polished floors, his face grim with the weight of what he'd been told. John Whitmore met him at the door, his own face ravaged by grief and rage, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the stairs. "She's in the nursery," he said, his voice breaking. "She killed them all. My boys, my little girl. She murdered them in their sleep." The constable nodded, his hand resting on his pistol, though he knew he wouldn't need it. Mercy hadn't moved from her corner since dawn. She was waiting for him. "Becca," the constable said, using her real name because he had known her since she was young. "Tell me what happened here." But Mercy just shook her head, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window, beyond the plantation, beyond this world entirely. She was thinking about another Christmas Eve, 8 years ago, when her own children had been torn from her arms, when promises had been broken and love had turned to ash, when the woman now grieving in the corner had stood silent and watched it happen. The story everyone would tell was simple. A slave nurse had gone mad and killed her master's children. The newspapers would call it a tragedy, a cautionary tale about trusting slaves with white children. They would say she snapped under the pressure, that she had always been unstable, that it was inevitable. But they were wrong. This wasn't madness. This was mathematics, a careful calculation of loss and payment, 8 years of planning disguised as devotion. 8 years of waiting for the perfect moment to balance the scales. Because Margaret Whitmore had made a promise once long ago, when Mercy was still young and foolish enough to believe in the goodness of white people. A promise about children and safety and love transcending color. A promise she had broken in the cruelest possible way, in front of Mercy's very eyes, with a smile on her lips and profit in her heart. And now, on this Christmas Eve, the bill had finally come due. The constable's questions came like slaps, sharp and insistent, but Mercy's answers were softer than whispers. Why did you do it? Did you plan this? What made you kill innocent children? Each question landed in the silence between them, unanswered, creating a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing moment. Mercy knew that her silence was a confession, that it sealed her fate as surely as if she had shouted her guilt from the rooftops. But she also knew that no explanation would suffice. No words could bridge the chasm between their worlds. Margaret stood in the doorway now, her children's blood on her nightgown, her face a mask of grief and fury. She was like family to us, she said to the constable, her voice hollow. We trusted her with our most precious possessions. We gave her a home, food, purpose. How could she do this to us? The words were carefully chosen, each one a knife designed to cut away any sympathy Mercy might receive. But Mercy heard what Margaret wasn't saying, the real story. The truth that lay buried beneath 8 years of pretense and performance. As the constable prepared to shackle her wrists, Mercy finally spoke, her voice so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear her. You want to know why? She asked, looking directly at Margaret for the first time since dawn. You really want to know what made me do this? Margaret's face went white, whiter than her children's sheets, whiter than the cotton that built her fortune, because she knew. She had always known this day would come. I remember everything, Mercy whispered, her words carrying the weight of 8 years of silent fury. Every promise you made, every lie you told, every moment you looked me in the eye and pretended to care while you planned their destruction. The constable frowned, confused by the exchange, but Margaret understood perfectly. Her hand flew to her throat as if she couldn't breathe, as if the truth itself was strangling her. And in that moment, as the constable's chains clicked around Mercy's wrists, as Margaret backed away from the woman who had been her children's beloved nurse, as the bodies of 3 innocent children grew cold in their beds, the real story finally began to unfold. Not the story of a mad slave who killed her master's children, but the story of 2 mothers, one promise, and the price of breaking the human heart beyond repair. 8 years earlier, Rebecca had been a different woman entirely. 24 years old, with hands that knew healing better than hurting, with a heart still foolish enough to believe that kindness could bridge any divide. She had arrived at Willowbrook Plantation in the spring of 1839, carrying her infant daughter Sarah in her arms and leading her 6-year-old son Daniel by the hand. The previous master had died, and his debts forced the sale of his human property. Rebecca found herself purchased by John Whitmore, a younger man with liberal ideas and a pregnant wife who needed a skilled midwife. Margaret Whitmore was nothing like the plantation mistresses Rebecca had known before. She was educated, well-read, and spoke passionately about the moral complexities of their peculiar institution. During those long conversations in the parlor, as Margaret's belly swelled with her first child, she would often place her hand on her stomach and speak about the future. Things are changing, Rebecca, she would say, her voice filled with conviction. The world is becoming more enlightened. Perhaps our children will grow up in a better time, where the circumstances of birth don't determine the worth of a soul. Rebecca wanted to believe her. More than that, she needed to believe her. After years of masters who saw her as nothing more than a breeding animal, Margaret's kindness felt like sunlight after endless winter. When Margaret went into labor with Thomas, Rebecca delivered the baby with gentle hands and infinite care. The birth was difficult, lasting 18 hours, and when it was over, Margaret wept with gratitude. "You saved our lives," she whispered, clutching Rebecca's hand. "Both of us. I will never forget that. I promise you, as long as I live, your children will be safe in my house." The promise had been given in the sacred space between life and death, in the moment when two women had shared something beyond the boundaries of race and bondage. Margaret had looked into Rebecca's eyes and sworn an oath that transcended the legal papers that defined their relationship. "Your Sarah and Daniel will grow up alongside my Thomas," she said. "They will learn to read and write. They will know freedom before they know chains. This I swear to you, on my son's life." For 3 years the promise held. Rebecca's children played in the big house gardens alongside young Thomas. Margaret taught all 3 children their letters, reading to them from the same books, sharing the same lessons. Daniel showed a remarkable aptitude for numbers, and Margaret encouraged him, bringing him mathematical texts from her husband's library. Sarah, barely walking when they arrived, grew into a bright, curious child who followed Thomas everywhere, their laughter echoing through the halls of Willowbrook. Rebecca began to hope. More dangerous than that, she began to plan. She imagined a future where her children might escape the fate that had claimed generations of their family. She saw Daniel as a teacher perhaps, or a clerk, using his quick mind for something more than picking cotton or breaking horses. She dreamed of Sarah married to a free man, raising children who would never know the weight of shackles. These were impossible dreams for a slave, but Margaret's promise made them feel real. The change came gradually, like a slow poison seeping through the foundation of their carefully constructed world. John Whitmore's investments began to fail. The cotton market fluctuated wildly, and several bad harvests left the plantation struggling. Margaret's idealism began to crack under the pressure of financial reality. Her conversations with Rebecca became shorter, more formal. The reading lessons continued, but less frequently. The children still played together, but now there were new rules, new boundaries that hadn't existed before. Rebecca noticed other changes too. Neighbors visited more frequently, men with calculating eyes who walked through the slave quarters like they were inspecting livestock. Margaret would join these tours, her face carefully neutral, pointing out the various workers and their skills. During one such visit, Rebecca overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. "That boy with the numbers," one visitor said. "He's bright enough to be valuable. Probably bring 800, maybe 1,000 if you clean him up properly." Margaret's response was too quiet to hear, but Rebecca saw her nod. The final blow came on Christmas Eve 1842, 5 years to the day before Rebecca would stand in that nursery with blood on her hands. The children were playing in the parlor when the men arrived. Rebecca was in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal, when she heard unfamiliar voices in the front hall. She moved closer to listen, her heart already beginning to race with a fear she couldn't yet name. "Contracts are all in order," John Whitmore was saying. "The boy is 12, strong and intelligent. The girl is 8, healthy, no defects. They should serve you well." Rebecca's knees nearly buckled. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more. A stranger's voice responded, "The price we discussed includes both children, 1,000 for the pair." Margaret's voice joined the conversation, steady and businesslike. "Yes, 1,000. They're both well-trained and obedient. You'll have no trouble with them." Rebecca burst into the parlor just as the strangers were examining her children like horses at auction. Daniel stood perfectly still, his young face already showing the terrible understanding that his world was ending. Sarah clung to Thomas, not comprehending why the adults looked so serious, why her brother had stopped smiling. "No," Rebecca whispered, the word torn from her throat like a physical thing. "Margaret, no, you promised. You swore to me." Margaret couldn't meet her eyes. She stood beside the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face a mask of composed indifference. "Rebecca, you must understand, we have obligations. The plantation must survive." Her voice was steady, practiced, as if she had rehearsed these words. "The children will be well cared for. Mr. Hodgson runs a respectable establishment in South Carolina. They will learn useful trades." "You promised me," Rebecca said again, louder now, her voice breaking with desperation. "On your son's life you promised me. They were going to be free. You said they would grow up with Thomas, that they would learn and read and—" Her words dissolved into sobs as the full magnitude of the betrayal crashed over her. This wasn't just a business transaction. This was the murder of everything she had hoped for, everything she had dared to dream. Sarah began to cry, sensing the adult terror without understanding its source. Daniel moved to his mother's side, his thin shoulders squared with a dignity that broke Rebecca's heart. At 12, he already understood what she was just beginning to accept. The promise had been a lie. The kindness had been performance. The love she thought she had seen in Margaret's eyes had been nothing more than the temporary affection one might feel for a useful animal. "Please," Rebecca begged, falling to her knees in front of Margaret. "Take me instead. Sell me, but let them stay. They're babies, Margaret. Sarah is only 8 years old. She calls you Aunt Margaret. She loves you." The words came in a rush, desperate and broken. "Daniel helps Thomas with his lessons. They're friends, their family. How can you do this to family?" Margaret finally looked at her, and in that moment Rebecca saw something that destroyed the last remnant of her hope. There was no struggle in Margaret's eyes, no hidden anguish, no secret war between duty and affection. There was only the cool calculation of a woman solving a problem. "They are not family, Rebecca," Margaret said quietly. "They are property, and property must sometimes be sold." The men moved efficiently, their practice evident in every gesture. They had shackles that fit small wrists, ropes that could subdue struggling children without leaving marks that would lower their value. Daniel didn't fight. He walked to the men with his head high, whispering something to Sarah that made her stop crying and take his hand. Rebecca lunged forward, desperate to touch them one last time, but strong hands held her back. "Mama," Sarah called out as they led her away, her voice high and confused. "Mama, when are we coming home?" Rebecca had no answer. She watched through the window as her children were loaded into a wagon, their small figures disappearing into the darkness. Daniel never looked back, but Sarah pressed her face against the wooden slats, her eyes searching for her mother until the wagon turned the bend and vanished from sight. That night, as Rebecca lay on her pallet in the servants' quarters, she made a different kind of promise. Not the naive hope she had once cherished, but a cold, hard vow that would sustain her through the years to come. Margaret Whitmore had shown her that love was nothing more than a convenience, that promises were tools to be discarded when they became inconvenient. Very well. Rebecca would learn to use the same tools. She would stay at Willowbrook. She would smile and serve and pretend to forgive. She would care for Margaret's children with the same gentle hands that had once cared for her own. She would earn their trust, their love, their complete dependence. And when the time was right, when the moment presented itself, she would show Margaret exactly what it felt like to have your children torn away in the darkness, to watch helplessly as everything you loved disappeared forever. The transformation wasn't immediate. For months, Rebecca grieved openly, her tears falling onto the bread she kneaded, her sobs echoing through the empty nursery where Thomas now played alone. Margaret allowed this display of emotion, perhaps even expected it. But gradually, as spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the tears stopped. Rebecca's smile returned, softer now but somehow more genuine. She threw herself into her duties with renewed dedication, caring for Thomas with an intensity that seemed to spring from love rather than obligation. Margaret was relieved. The unpleasantness of the sale was behind them now, and Rebecca had proven herself resilient, adaptable. When Margaret became pregnant with Caroline, Rebecca attended to her with the same skill and devotion she had shown during Thomas's birth. She delivered Caroline safely, held Margaret's hand through the long labor, whispered words of encouragement and comfort. Margaret forgot, or chose to forget, the woman who had begged on her knees for her children's lives. But Rebecca remembered everything. Every word of that Christmas Eve betrayal was carved into her memory like scripture. Every time she tucked Thomas into bed, she thought of Daniel, wondering if he was warm wherever they had taken him. Every time she combed Caroline's hair, she remembered Sarah's soft curls slipping through her fingers one last time. The love she showed Margaret's children was real, but it was also weapons forged in the fire of her loss. By 1845, Rebecca had become indispensable to the Whitmore household. She had delivered baby James with the same gentle expertise that had brought Thomas and Caroline into the world, and Margaret trusted her completely with all three children. The plantation had recovered financially, John's investments had stabilized, and the family settled into a comfortable routine that revolved around Rebecca's quiet efficiency. She was no longer just a nurse but a cornerstone of their domestic world, the woman who knew exactly how Thomas liked his porridge, who could calm Caroline's nightmares with a single lullaby, who could make baby James laugh when no one else could. Margaret often remarked to her friends about Rebecca's transformation. "She was devastated when we had to sell her children," she would say over tea, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone recounting an old tragedy. "But she has found new purpose in caring for mine. I truly believe she loves Thomas, Caroline, and James as if they were her own blood." The irony of these words was lost on Margaret, but not on Rebecca, who heard them from the kitchen where she prepared the very refreshments Margaret served to her guests. Rebecca had indeed found new purpose, but it was not the maternal devotion Margaret imagined. Every day brought her closer to her goal. Every small kindness she showed the children was another thread in the web she was weaving. She studied their routines with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. She learned their fears, their comforts, their dependencies. Thomas, now 11, was terrified of the dark and couldn't sleep without his special blanket. Caroline, approaching 9, had developed a ritual of counting her dolls before bed, her anxiety spiking if even one was missing. Baby James, at 4 years old, would only drink his milk if Rebecca warmed it to precisely the right temperature and sang him the lullaby about mockingbirds. These small details became weapons in Rebecca's arsenal. She began to make herself even more essential, creating dependencies where none had existed before. When Thomas had trouble with his mathematics, Rebecca offered to help, using the skills Daniel had once shown such promise in. When Caroline had nightmares, Rebecca was the only one who could provide comfort, her presence more effective than any medicine. When James refused to eat, Rebecca alone could coax him to take his meals. The children began to need her in ways that went beyond mere care. They needed her for their very sense of security and stability. John Whitmore noticed the change and approved. "Rebecca has become quite remarkable," he told Margaret one evening as they watched her lead the children in their evening prayers. "The children are so well behaved, so content. Whatever trauma she experienced when we sold her children has clearly been resolved." Margaret nodded, pleased with her own wisdom in keeping Rebecca despite the initial difficulties. Neither of them saw the calculation in Rebecca's eyes as she tucked their precious children into bed, or noticed how her gentle kisses on their foreheads lingered just a moment too long, as if she were memorizing the feel of their skin. The waiting was the hardest part. Rebecca had learned patience in the years since her children were taken, but the hunger for justice gnawed at her constantly. She watched Margaret laugh with friends, saw her embrace her children without the shadow of loss that haunted every moment of Rebecca's existence. There were nights when the rage threatened to overwhelm her completely, when she stood over the sleeping children with trembling hands, imagining how easy it would be to end her suffering immediately. But those moments passed. She had something more perfect in mind, something that would ensure Margaret experienced the full weight of her betrayal. The plan crystallized during the summer of 1847, when news arrived that changed everything. A letter came from South Carolina, from the plantation where Daniel and Sarah had been sold 5 years earlier. John Whitmore read it first, his face growing pale as he absorbed the contents. He called Margaret into his study and closed the door, but their raised voices carried through the house. Rebecca pressed her ear to the keyhole, her heart pounding as she caught fragments of their conversation. "Both of them?" Margaret's voice was sharp with something that might have been guilt. "Dead? How?" John's response was muffled, but Rebecca caught the essential details. Fever had swept through the South Carolina plantation. Daniel had died first, at 17, his mathematical mind silenced forever by disease and overwork. Sarah had survived only a few days longer, calling for her mother with her dying breath. They had been buried in unmarked graves, their deaths recorded only as a loss of property in a ledger book. Rebecca felt something fundamental break inside her chest, a final fracture that completed the transformation she had been undergoing for 5 years. Her children were gone forever, not just lost to her but erased from the world entirely. There would be no miraculous reunion, no chance to see them grown and free, no possibility that her sacrifice might somehow be undone. They had died as slaves, anonymous and unmourned, their potential unfulfilled, their love unreturned. And Margaret Whitmore slept peacefully upstairs, surrounded by her own healthy, cherished children. That night, Rebecca made her final plans. Christmas Eve was still months away, but she knew it would be the perfect time. The symbolism was too powerful to resist, the echo of the night her own children had been torn away too perfect to ignore. Margaret would learn what it felt like to lose everything on the holiest night of the year, would understand that some betrayals could never be forgiven, some promises could never be broken without consequence. The months that followed were a masterpiece of deception. Rebecca became even more devoted, even more loving toward the Whitmore children. She told them stories that Sarah had once loved, taught them games that Daniel had invented, shared with them the legacy of the children they had unknowingly replaced. Thomas began to call her Mama Rebecca when his parents weren't around, a term of endearment that cut her heart like a blade. Caroline would curl up in her lap during thunderstorms, trusting her completely to keep the fears at bay. Baby James learned to take his first steps by walking to her outstretched arms. These moments of genuine affection were perhaps the cruelest part of her plan. Rebecca discovered that she truly did love these children, despite everything, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. They were innocent of their parents' sins, blameless in the machinery of slavery that had destroyed her family. But innocence would not save them. It had not saved Daniel and Sarah, and it would not save Thomas, Caroline, and James. Love, Rebecca had learned, was not enough to protect anyone in this world. As autumn turned to winter, Rebecca began her preparations. She studied the children's sleeping patterns with scientific precision, noting how deeply they slept, how long it took for them to wake, what sounds might disturb their rest. She experimented with different herbs in their evening milk, not enough to harm them, but enough to ensure they would sleep more soundly than usual. She practiced moving through their rooms in complete darkness, memorizing every creaking floorboard, every obstacle that might betray her presence. The most difficult part was maintaining her facade with Margaret. As December approached, Margaret grew increasingly sentimental about Christmas, planning elaborate celebrations and gift-giving ceremonies. She spoke often of how blessed she felt, how grateful she was for her beautiful family, how much joy the children brought to her life. "I cannot imagine existing without them," she told Rebecca one evening as they wrapped presents together. "They are my whole world, my reason for being. I would die if anything happened to them." Rebecca nodded and smiled, her fingers steady as she tied ribbons around packages that the children would never open. "I understand completely," she said, her voice warm with false sympathy. "A mother's love for her children is the most powerful force in the world. Nothing can break that bond, can it?" Margaret agreed enthusiastically, never noticing the double meaning in Rebecca's words, never seeing the quiet fury that burned behind her gentle expression. On December 20th, Rebecca received an unexpected gift. A traveling preacher arrived at the plantation, carrying news and letters from various parts of the South. Among his correspondence was a final message about Daniel and Sarah, passed along by someone who had known them in South Carolina. The letter described their final days in heartbreaking detail. Daniel had used his last strength to comfort other dying slaves, sharing what little food he could find, teaching younger children their letters even as fever consumed him. Sarah had died clutching a small wooden doll she had carved herself, whispering prayers for the mother she barely remembered but had never stopped loving. That night, Rebecca knelt beside her pallet and made her final peace with what she was about to do. She thought of Daniel's courage and Sarah's faithfulness, of the love that had sustained them even in their suffering. She thought of Margaret's casual betrayal, of promises broken for profit, of children treated as commodities in a world that valued property over humanity. The mathematics were simple now, clear and undeniable. 3 lives for 2, plus 5 years of compound interest on unpaid emotional debt. The scales would finally balance. Christmas Eve arrived with a light snow that dusted the grounds of Willowbrook Plantation like sugar on a cake. The house glowed with candles and warmth, filled with the laughter of children who had no idea this would be their last day on Earth. Margaret bustled about, overseeing final preparations for the Christmas feast, while John met with visiting relatives in his study. Rebecca moved through her duties with perfect calm, serving hot cider to the guests, helping the children rehearse their Christmas recitations, tucking them into bed with extra care and attention. At 11 o'clock, when the house had finally settled into sleep, Rebecca rose from her pallet and walked barefoot through the familiar halls. She carried no weapon except her own hands, the same gentle hands that had brought life into the world, that had healed wounds and eased suffering, that had loved and comforted and protected. Tonight, those hands would serve a different purpose, would become instruments of a justice that the law would never provide. She stood outside Thomas's door for a long moment, listening to his peaceful breathing, remembering the eager boy who had once played with Daniel, who had shared lessons and laughter and dreams of the future. Then she turned the handle and stepped inside, her heart finally at peace with what love and loss had made her become. Thomas never woke up. Rebecca had expected him to stir when she entered his room, perhaps to call out sleepily asking for water or comfort from a bad dream. But the herbs she had been adding to his evening milk for weeks had done their work perfectly. He lay on his back, arms sprawled across his coverlet, mouth slightly open, breathing deep and regular. Rebecca stood beside his bed for several minutes, watching the rise and fall of his chest, memorizing the peaceful expression on his face. This boy who had once played with Daniel, who had learned his letters alongside Sarah, who had never known that his childhood happiness was built on the ashes of another family's dreams. She pressed the pillow over his face with the same gentle pressure she had once used to ease him to sleep during illness. Thomas stirred only slightly, his body responding instinctively to the loss of air, but the drugs in his system kept him from truly waking. His small hands moved weakly against the coverlet, not in panic, but in the confused movements of someone caught between sleep and consciousness. Rebecca held the pillow firmly but tenderly, whispering the lullabies she had once sung to her own children, the same melodies that had comforted Sarah during thunderstorms and helped Daniel drift off after long days in the fields. When his breathing stopped, Rebecca removed the pillow and arranged Thomas's body carefully, smoothing his hair, adjusting his nightclothes, positioning his arms in a natural sleeping pose. To anyone who found him in the morning, he would appear to have died peacefully in his sleep, perhaps from a fever or the weak heart that sometimes claimed children without warning. She kissed his forehead, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized she was crying, and whispered, "Say hello to Daniel for me when you see him." Caroline's room was next. The 9-year-old had always been the lightest sleeper of the 3 children, prone to nightmares and sudden awakenings that required Rebecca's comfort. Tonight, however, the combination of holiday excitement and carefully administered herbs had claimed her completely. She lay curled on her side, clutching the rag doll Rebecca had made for her last Christmas, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spun gold. Caroline had been the child most like Sarah in temperament, curious and affectionate, always asking questions about the world beyond the plantation. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, stroking Caroline's hair with infinite tenderness. This child had called her Mama Rebecca in private moments, had confided her fears and dreams, had trusted her with the complete faith that only children possess. The irony was not lost on Rebecca that Caroline's doll, sewn with Rebecca's own hands, would be the last thing the child ever held. She had poured love into every stitch of that doll, the same love she had once given to toys for Sarah, the same maternal devotion that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and bondage. The pillow descended over Caroline's face like a cloud passing over the moon. The child's breathing hitched once, twice, and then gradually slowed to nothing. Rebecca continued stroking her hair throughout the process, murmuring the prayers Caroline had learned at her knee, the same words of comfort and protection that had failed to save Daniel and Sarah. When it was over, Rebecca carefully arranged Caroline's body, ensuring the doll remained in her arms, maintaining the illusion of peaceful sleep that would greet Margaret in the morning. Baby James presented the greatest challenge, not because he was difficult to approach, but because he was still so very young. At 4 years old, he was barely past toddlerhood, still possessing the complete innocence that made Rebecca's task feel like the deepest sin she could possibly commit. He slept in the nursery where Rebecca had spent countless hours, rocking him through teething pain, singing him to sleep when storms frightened him, teaching him his first words and watching his first steps. This room held more memories of genuine joy than any other place in the house. James lay sprawled across his small bed, having kicked off his covers in the way active children do even in sleep. His thumb was in his mouth, a habit Margaret had tried unsuccessfully to break, and his other hand clutched the wooden horse John had carved for his last birthday. Rebecca had been present for that gift-giving, had seen the pride on John's face as his youngest son squealed with delight, had felt her heart contract with memory of toys Daniel had once treasured with equal enthusiasm. She lifted James gently, cradling him in her arms the way she had when he was an infant, the way she had once held her own babies when they needed comfort. He stirred slightly but didn't wake, instead nestling closer to her warmth with the trust of a child who had never known fear in her presence. Rebecca held him for a long time, rocking slowly in the chair where she had spent so many peaceful hours, humming the mockingbird lullaby that had always been his favorite. She thought about the promise Margaret had made 8 years ago, about children growing up free and educated, about a world where love might transcend the artificial divisions that destroyed families. When she finally pressed the pillow over James's small face, Rebecca felt something inside her chest tear apart completely. This was not justice anymore, not balance or mathematics or righteous revenge. This was simply the destruction of innocence by someone who had been broken beyond repair. James's body barely struggled, his small limbs going limp almost immediately. Rebecca removed the pillow and held him close, his lifeless weight familiar and foreign all at once. She whispered apologies to his still form, knowing they were inadequate, knowing that nothing could justify what she had done except the unbearable weight of her own loss. The walk back to her quarters felt like a journey across an entire lifetime. Rebecca moved through the halls of Willowbrook Plantation as if sleepwalking, her feet finding their way by memory through the darkness. Behind her lay 3 children who would never wake, 3 futures cut short, 3 lights extinguished by hands that had once brought only healing and comfort. Ahead lay whatever consequences would follow, the rope that was already being woven, the grave that was already being dug. But for now, there was only silence, and the strange peace that comes when a long journey finally reaches its end. She did not sleep during the remaining hours before dawn. Instead, she sat on her pallet and remembered everything. Daniel teaching Thomas to skip stones by the creek, his patience endless as he showed the younger boy the proper wrist motion. Sarah braiding Caroline's hair with careful fingers, creating elaborate patterns that made both girls giggle with delight. The 4 children playing together in the garden, their laughter echoing across the grounds, their friendship untainted by the adult world of ownership and bondage. These were the memories she chose to carry with her into whatever came next. Margaret's scream shattered the morning quiet at precisely 7 o'clock. Rebecca had been expecting it, had been counting the minutes until the household would begin to stir, until someone would enter the children's rooms to wake them for Christmas morning. The sound cut through the plantation like a blade, sharp with disbelief and grief and dawning horror. Footsteps pounded through the halls, Voices called out in panic. Doors slammed as the terrible discovery spread from room to room. Rebecca rose from her pallet and walked calmly to the kitchen to begin preparing breakfast, as she had every morning for 8 years. She set the table for 5 people, as she always did, laying out the good china Margaret saved for Christmas morning. She prepared Thomas's favorite porridge, Caroline's special eggs, James's warm milk with honey. Only when the constable arrived and called her name did she stop her work, wiping her hands on her apron with the same careful attention to detail she brought to every domestic task. The trial lasted 3 days, though the outcome was never in doubt. Rebecca offered no defense, made no attempt to deny her guilt, showed no emotion as witness after witness testified to her character, her devotion to the family, her apparent love for the children she had murdered. The prosecutor painted her as a monster disguised as a caregiver, a snake who had hidden her venomous nature until the perfect moment to strike. The few voices raised in her defense spoke of grief and madness, of a woman driven beyond reason by the loss of her own children years earlier. But Rebecca knew they were all wrong. She was neither monster nor madwoman, but simply a mother who had been pushed beyond the breaking point by a world that treated love as a luxury and children as property. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict: death by hanging, to be carried out on New Year's Day 1848, exactly 1 week after the crime. Rebecca received the sentence with the same calm she had shown throughout the proceedings, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on something beyond the courtroom walls. Margaret attended the execution, standing at the front of the crowd that gathered to witness justice being served. She wore black mourning clothes and a veil that hid her face, but Rebecca could feel her presence like a cold wind. When the sheriff asked if she had any final words, Rebecca looked directly at the woman who had once promised to protect her children, who had sworn sacred oaths and broken them for profit, who now stood as chief mourner for the consequences of her own betrayal. "I kept my promise," Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "I loved your children as if they were my own. I cared for them, protected them, gave them every comfort I could provide. But you taught me that love is not enough in this world, that promises are made to be broken, that children are nothing more than property to be bought and sold. So I treated your property exactly as you treated mine. The only difference is that mine died slowly in sickness and sorrow, calling for a mother who could never come to them. Yours died peacefully in their own beds, surrounded by love." She paused, her eyes never leaving Margaret's veiled figure. "Tell me, which of us showed more mercy?" The rope silenced any response Margaret might have made. Rebecca's body swung gently in the morning breeze as the crowd dispersed, some satisfied that justice had been served, others troubled by questions they couldn't quite articulate. Margaret stood longest of all, staring up at the woman who had destroyed her world as completely as her own had once been destroyed. When she finally turned to leave, her steps were unsteady, her grief now mixed with something that might have been understanding. The story of Mercy, the nurse who killed her master's children on Christmas Eve, spread throughout Virginia and beyond. Some told it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting slaves with white children. Others whispered it as a different kind of lesson, about the price of breaking promises, about the mathematics of loss and revenge, about what happens when love is perverted into something harder and more terrible. In the slave quarters of 100 plantations, mothers held their own children closer and wondered what they would do if faced with Rebecca's impossible choice. Years later, when the war finally came and slavery crumbled beneath its own contradictions, some remembered the Christmas Eve murders as a harbinger of the reckoning that was always inevitable. They said that Rebecca had been not just a killer but a prophet, showing the slave-holding South exactly what its peculiar institution would ultimately cost. 3 innocent children dead in their beds, and a woman who chose damnation rather than accept that some betrayals could go unanswered, some promises could be broken without consequence. The Whitmore plantation was sold within a year, Margaret unable to bear living in the house where her children had died. She moved to Richmond, became a recluse, spent her remaining years writing letters to newspapers condemning the institution of slavery that had created the circumstances for such tragedy. She never remarried, never had other children, lived alone with her grief and the growing understanding that she had been not just a victim, but an architect of the very system that destroyed both families. In the end, Rebecca achieved something that escaped most slaves of her generation. She proved that even the powerless could exact terrible prices from their oppressors, that love perverted into hatred could move mountains, that a promise broken could echo through generations. Her name was remembered when those of her masters were forgotten, her story passed down as both warning and inspiration, depending on who was listening and what they needed to hear. The children's graves in the Whitmore family cemetery bore elaborate headstones describing them as angels taken too soon by a trusted servant's inexplicable madness. But Rebecca's unmarked grave in the potter's field told a different story to those who knew how to read it. Here lay a woman who had been driven beyond mercy, beyond reason, beyond humanity itself by a world that valued property over people. Here lay the price of treating children as commodities and mothers as breeders. Here lay the mathematical certainty that every cruelty would eventually find its balance, every betrayal its reckoning, every broken promise its terrible answer. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to understand that history's most powerful lessons often come wrapped in its darkest truths. The stories they don't teach in schools are the ones we need to remember most.